You make me so excited. I know that you're my kind and you're a big girl. What can I say? Ruby, let me love you. Let's get it right. And girl, I want you in my life. I know that you're not sure enough. You think that you just can't be loved, but I can see the...
I don't get paid anything for this, son. I love music. I love sharing music. And this is music from my friend Jason Brewer. He's actually appeared on this podcast back in episode 82. We talked about his band, The Explorers Club, his fondness for that classic old school rock sound, his fundamentalist upbringing, all that sort of thing. But anyway, this music you're hearing right now is from the new self-titled Explorers Club that just dropped in the last month. I'm telling you, it's ear candy. It is ear candy. There'll be a full song at the end of this episode to further convince you of that. And oh yeah, by the way, Explorers Club also released an album called To Sing and Be Born Again, full of covers. You guys enjoy. Get this stuff anywhere you get your music. All right. Welcome, all you warriors for God, you lionesses. I get the sentiment. I get it. I understand. But, forget all that. When I'm weak, he's strong, bull. Right. Oh, man, lionesses. Hey, I hope everybody's had a pretty good summer. I actually saved someone, like literally saved their life. I was at the beach with my children. We were out pretty deep, I was making sure they were all okay. But this woman said, sir, and I looked over there and I saw her struggling. Passed my sunglasses off to my son and darted out in her direction. She basically was not able to stay afloat, and so I just kind of put my arm around her, told her to hold on. She was like hyperventilating and she started crying. I said, calm down, everything is fine. You're fine now, you're fine. And she kind of got her composure back, and I tell you what, man, I was a hero that day. Only I wasn't, because basically she was a very, very short woman, and once I told her to grab hold of me, I basically walked her into more shallow water. Oh, my goodness. Hey, I am excited about this episode. It is a perfect example of just how people can differ but still come to the table and have a good discussion. These guys, by the way, they were at it about 3 years ago. If you want to check out episode 105, AI and a Debate About God with Jack Hoey and Godless. But today, we just basically strip down to the bare bone and have a good old-fashioned debate about God. You enjoy, and again, in the show notes, catch up with us on that Pastor with No Answers discussion page. We have a lot of fun. All right, you guys have a good one, lionesses. All right, we are here with Godless and Jack Hoey. Godless, it has been a while, man. How you been doing without God?
It's been interesting. I moved back to the United States from Ireland since the last time we spoke. Yeah, and it was funny. You were reminding me earlier that we had talked about artificial intelligence before. So I've been out getting myself certified in AI, trying to learn how to do it myself. So that's been kind of fun.
Are you serious?
I'm totally serious. And then,
what do you mean do that on your own? What are you talking about?
Well, like actually code it. Like, give me a boatload of data and let me see if I can build a artificial intelligence that will make predictions at a better level than a human could.
Dang, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's so far. And then, just the last thing has just been this entire coronavirus lockdown has been really tough. And I know it's old hat to speak of and all that sort of thing. But, I'm reminded of, because this has been one of the most emotionally challenging things for a lot of people, I'm sure, and myself included. And I'm reminded of the times when I felt like there was, I could just close my eyes, press my hands together, and there was help there. And especially once I got to a certain age where it got frustrating when I didn't hear anything back, and nothing made me feel more alone than when I had been assured by everyone that there was someone, we'll put that in quotes, out there who will help. And yet when I reached out, wouldn't get anything. And so for those of your listeners who might be going through the same sort of thing, it's okay, because there's plenty of us humans out here to help you out. Reach out to a human, you will hear an answer back. It's
I like
cool.
it. And sometime in the distant future, you can reach out to Godless's complex Excel spreadsheet AI robot for help also.
That's right.
All right, so here's what we're going to do. For our audience, what I did, I'm pretty sure this conversation is just going to go on cruise control here in a second. I've asked Jack to bring 4 reasons why he does believe in God, and Godless to bring 4 reasons to the contrary. And just for the listener's sake, this is not necessarily the God of the Bible that we're talking about. Actually, I don't know if that's going to be Jack's posture or not, but Godless, I know that you're just speaking of God in general. But before we do that, I got to put both of you on the hot seat and have a little bit of fun. And so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask you a question, and you literally have 15 seconds to answer, and after 15 seconds I'll go "Brr," and Godless, what's wrong, man?
Oh, I'm stressed.
All right, no, these they're not like dig deep questions, so I think you'll be fine. So first question for you, Godless: when it comes to your atheism, do you feel a calling to make converts?
Oh, 100%. Absolutely. Sorry, I should take 15 seconds to go ding, 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 ding.
Oh,
so
I'm watching the time. You're almost out.
Oh, shoot. Oh, to give the answer, I thought, yeah, absolutely. Because
Burp. All right. So you can go more into that here in a second, but that's great. We hear your yes and no. Jack, what would it take for you to stop believing in God?
So I'm 63. I think it would be pretty hard for me to reach a conclusion that is different than the accumulated weight of the conclusions I've drawn over the last 45 years, being honest.
Perfect. All right, Godless, what would it take for you to change your mind in believing that there is a God?
Well, I know this sounds like a terrible answer, and it's unsatisfying, but it's true. If there is a God, that God knows exactly what I need to be convinced, and that will be it.
Fair enough. All right, Godless, sticking with you, how convinced on a we'll say from 0% to 100%, how convinced are you that there is no God?
Probably around 98 to 99%.
98 to 99%.
Although I should say,
you only got 2 more seconds.
Whenever there's a question like that, I always feel like we need to define exactly what is meant by a God. It just gets me in trouble with the wife all the time.
That's fine. Jack, same thing for you. How convinced are you that there is a God?
I guess once you get above 90%, what number do you pick? I mean, I would say it's somewhere above there. Would I say 98? Would I say 95? I don't know, but
Gotcha.
Very high.
Two very smart men almost, we'll just go ahead and round it to 100, almost convinced that God for sure exists or doesn't exist. Godless, can absolute morality exist without a God?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
That's a tough question. Yeah, but no, I don't think so. But I think that that's okay. I think that history has shown that morality evolving, just like everything else, is good.
Right. Cool. Jack, same question. Can absolute morality exist without a God?
I agree. I think it's hard to argue that it could, because basically you're going to have different people coming from different angles, and they're all going to have opinions. How can you argue that one of them is absolutely true and the others are not?
All right. Godless, what represents the toughest case against atheism? Like, when you think about your belief in atheism, what in your mind is the strongest argument against it?
It's when individuals say that they had an experience that is not measurable. It's not. It's 100% internalized, and it makes it really, really hard to convince them that it didn't happen, because there's no way to verify whether it did or didn't.
Okay. Well, what I like that answer. It's interesting, but what I'm saying is basically what is something that challenges you. Like you say, I'm an atheist, but man, I tell you what, it's hard to merge atheism with
or
and
maybe
such.
Another way to frame it is, where does that 1 to 2% of uncertainty come from? What are the things that keep that open?
Well, I guess I would say that, I don't know.
Okay, fair enough. Jack, what represents the toughest case against the existence of God for you?
I think the apparent randomness of life, and in particular the random cruelty that life inflicts on people who you'd say they don't deserve that.
Okay. Yep. All right, so last question for both of you. We'll stick with Jack on this one. Jack, do you have, and I will let you define close friends. We won't get into that. Do you have close friends that do not believe in God?
Yes.
How about you, Godless? Do you have close friends that believe in God?
I live in Texas, man. Of course I do.
Yeah, you have to totally isolate yourself, man, if you're in Texas and you can't be friends with people that believe in God.
That's like I was saying. I've been self-isolating long before it was cool.
Yeah. All right, so let's transition to what you guys, the homework that y'all did to bring to the table for this episode, and I'll just go ahead and start with Jack. And I think what we'll do is we'll let you guys take turns, and so Jack will express his first point as far as why he is convinced there's a God, and we'll give you guys time to go back and forth. Let's try to shoot some holes in it and that sort of thing, and we'll let Jack respond. Then we'll throw it over to Godless. You give us our first, and we'll just go back and forth and see where it goes. How about that?
Excellent.
All right. So
thanks, Joey.
Yeah, man. Jack, how about you? What's your number one point? And by the way, would this be in any sort of chronological order as far as the most, is number one the most important for
No,
you?
it's not.
Okay.
And so so I would say the one reason is that I believe the Bible is true. So let me explain what I mean by that, though. So, Godless, I don't know if you've ever read Anna Karenina, Tolstoy's novel. Great, if you read novels at all, it's one of the great novels. And so I believe that Anna Karenina is true. Now, fictional characters, it's a made-up story. What do I mean by that? The first line of the novel, a very famous line, is, happy families are all alike. Unhappy families are each unhappy in their own way. And, the novel kind of explicates his view of where happiness and meaning in life comes from. And I believe it's true. Now, I don't mean exclusively true. I mean, it's brilliant. It sheds insights on life that I think are profound. So that's what I think about the Bible. I came to faith through reading the Bible, and what struck me was that it rang true to me. And it rang true about the way it describes what life is like and what people are like. life is messy and confusing, and there are unresolved tensions, and the Bible is, embraces that. So, like one of my examples, Joey's heard me use it, is the book of Proverbs, which is kind of you could argue is kind of the conventional religious wisdom. Do good and you'll be rewarded. Honor God and he'll honor you, and so on. And then Ecclesiastes comes right after it in the text that we have. And it kind of says, not necessarily. It's sometimes bad things happen to good people. Sometimes it's the opposite of what you would expect. The race doesn't always go to the swift or the battle to the strong, but time and chance happen to everybody. And I think both of those are true. Now, they're both very different angles on the truth. They're expressed differently, but they both present true aspects about life that we can't necessarily reconcile. And so the fact that, teaches in that way, to me, that rings true to life. There are lots of unresolved tensions in life. People are complex. No one is wholly good. And the Bible's very honest about, people who are presented as heroes, yet who had profound flaws, who did awful things. And it doesn't try to sugarcoat that. A good life is defined by our relationships. The teaching of the New Testament relentlessly is live a life of love. That's what you're called to do. And that again, has the ring of truth to me. So when I say the Bible is true, I'm not arguing for a particular theological stance on inerrancy or anything like that. I'm saying when I read the Bible, it had the ring of truth to me about what life is like.
So can I ask, how does that speak to the existence or non-existence of the God that the Bible purports exists?
Yeah. So I think the other thing that the Bible does is it kind of takes you through this progressive revelation. One of the things that theologians would say is we can't learn directly about God. We can only learn what God reveals to us, and it kind of is this unfolding process over time. And as people came to grasp different aspects of what God was like and how that related to the human condition, that's how I would answer your question. I don't know if that's a fair answer or not, Godless.
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure. Like for example, you mentioned Anna Karenina. It's like, yes, it speaks to, as you're saying, like these true things about humans, but Anna Karenina doesn't purport that the characters in the book are true.
Right.
And you draw the connection to the Bible. I would agree with you that for some parts, the Bible does speak truth about humans, but it doesn't in the same way, therefore, support the existence of its characters.
Okay. Yeah. And what I would say is, one of the other things that the Bible says about itself is it makes claims about what the purpose of its writing is. And one way it's expressed is to make you wise for salvation. So, what I'm saying is I think the Bible, because I recognize in my mind the ring of truth and the way it talks about life, it's like I'm open to reading then. I'm open to trying to understand what it says about what that meaning of life is and who God might be. So that's what I'm saying. I approach it from the point of view of I've read this book that it's like wow, this is profound. I need to pay attention to this.
But would other books, particularly ones of fiction, that make claims that are similar, even when they speak truth about the human condition, do you therefore then buy the claim that the book in fiction would make about, say, again, the existence of its characters?
Well, of course not. They're deliberately written with a different intention.
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure if there is a difference because, like, for example, if I were reading a book of fiction, as you brought up, in the first chapter says, everything I'm about to tell you is true. And then it told a ridiculous story, but it had these really great truths about the human condition and also said a lot of things that I liked and so on and so forth. Like, I'd walk away from that book going, oh, okay, great. This was a great read, entertaining, and spoke a lot of truth, but I wouldn't therefore then go, but that thing in chapter 1 where it said, everything I'm about to tell you is true, and then followed with a bunch of stuff that's absolutely ridiculous, I wouldn't go, well, despite the ridiculousness, no, it said that this stuff was true, when that doesn't even really come into it. How is that different from the Bible. And
look, I'm like, again, we're trying to talk across genres. It's a little difficult. And I appreciate your question, though. I mean, of course, the starting point is here's a work of fiction, so I know it's not true. I mean, and if what you're referring to, though, is here's all these seemingly impossible things that the Bible relates, and you're saying you believe those because it has this, these wise words over here in this other section. My kind of thing is, we make assumptions about what we're willing to accept, and they define what we think a lot of times is reasonable and true. So let me, if it's okay, I'll tell you what one of my other 4 points is, and that is
okay.
I believe Jesus rose from the dead, which might be an example of what you would term as how in the world could you possibly believe something like that? And I mean,
well, I
can go through and explain my reasons for believing that, but I'm not trying to walk away, I guess, from the idea of, hey, if I say that the Bible is true, here are some other things that come along with that.
I guess
I just don't want
to. Let's pull back from the idea that we're comparing a work of fiction to
sure.
what you would argue is not a work of fiction, which would be the Bible, right?
Uh-huh.
Like, even if I'm reading a book and I don't know whether it's fiction or nonfiction, I can still buy a lot of the things that it says are true about the human condition, but everything else that it may claim about reality, I'm going to want to measure that against what is either there is evidence for or sort of matches things that I've seen. I would use, I guess, what would be one of my arguments, which is by the same logic that I believe anything and everything else that I'm introduced to, by the same logic that I use to measure whether those things are true, I would do the same thing with the claims in the Bible. I think that would be wholly separate if we're comparing book to book to book, separate from whether you believe what it says about people are true or not.
Okay. So I guess part of my thing would be, so I've got two responses to that. One of them would be if I'm listening to somebody and they say something, and I can tell by listening to, here's a person who's wise and good and they think carefully and they're not and then they said something that might seem outlandish, I would be inclined more to consider the outlandish thing and consider whether my assumptions were wrong, because I'd say, but I'm listening to a person who's demonstrated that they're wise and good and thoughtful. So, part of the thing I think is, that I would say is with the Bible, some of the things that people would question and say, well, that's clearly just that's an article of faith and you got to swallow a lot to swallow that one. Yeah. I'd say, yeah, I understand, and part of where I'm coming from is I'm drawn in by the wisdom that I see there. The second thing, though, that I would say is, first rule of literary criticism is understand what genre of literature you're reading. So, do I believe that the Bible was created in 7 24-hour days? No, I do not. Well, the Bible was created, that the universe, the material world was created in 7 literal days. I do not. Well, the Bible says that. Well, in a poem at the beginning. And poems, if you wanted to have something interpreted literally, you would write it in prose. You would not write a poem. So I don't look at that as here's a scientific explanation of how things happened. I look at it as an evocative way of saying, there's a design. Now, again, I realize that's a controversial question in itself, but does that address?
Well, yeah, I guess, but I think that speaks to the very thing that I'm bringing up. Like, why wouldn't you believe that the world was created in 7 days?
Because what I'm saying is, I look at it and I say, here's this poetic work. Now, how does the writer intend me to interpret that? I can't know that across the scope, the range of centuries.
But if I may interrupt a second,
sure.
That would be your interpretation of that portion of the Bible, and it's certainly, as you just alluded to, a very, very different interpretation than most everybody else has had for centuries and centuries and centuries.
Yeah, but that doesn't make. Oh yeah, I need to just.
Well, two things. I would say, first of all, I think that the idea of the 7-day creation is something that is much more of an American fundamentalism issue than it has been true of Christianity through the centuries. For example, that's not the position of the Catholic Church. That is, well, I don't know when since forever is, I guess, what I would say.
I'd be shocked if that were true, but I'll look that up.
Yeah, do that. But that's what you always have to do whenever you're reading something. It's always you're interpreting to some extent.
Yeah, but I'm not. This is where it gets tricky. If I'm reading a book and it says this is very true, I take it from within the context as to whether it is or is not. And what I'll do, for example, if I was reading some other book that claimed that the earth was made in 7 days, the first thing I'll do is what I would suggest is probably what's happening here, whether you recognize it or not, is I would look at, okay, well, what's the scientific evidence that what this is claiming is true or not? And then because there is just an absolute immense amount of evidence that it is not true by any stretch of the imagination, I'd go, okay, well, then that claim is not true. To then say, oh, well, actually, no, this is just a parable, well, that's a different step. And I can't recall offhand another time I've read any book and thought to myself, oh, well, it's not, it made the claim to be true, especially if it was a book that was claiming to be nonfiction. I would not like read that and then look up other evidence and say, oh, well, turns out that the evidence is absolutely not true. Well, maybe they're just making a general point when they don't then state what it is that the point was that they were trying to make. Yeah, well, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to address that as succinctly. So if I get off track, please don't hesitate to. Good. But I would say, hey, in looking at the Bible or any other thing that is making truth claims, you've got to look at external evidence. So yes, does it make sense to look at scientific evidence and say, is a 7-day creation make sense? Does that seem to be where the outside evidence would lead you? No, it does not. So therefore, you'd look at it and say, okay, well then I either need to reject this, or I need to consider whether I'm interpreting it in a way that isn't true to what the author's intent was. Well, see, this is. Can I move to one point, because I think we're
please, yes.
All right.
We
could probably, Joey, to be honest, we could probably spend an hour just on this.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. You guys take it anywhere you want. This is. But
good. I think that that speaks to one of the biggest reasons that I've had an issue with the purported existence of God is that the goalposts have been moved over and over and over again throughout history. As we as humans learn more about our natural world, all of these claims to reasons or evidence for the existence of a God are washed away one after another. When for example, the Genesis book was written, it was purporting to be true because there was no evidence to the contrary. When Jesus says, and Jesus never did, when people claimed that Jesus was the Son of God, there was no evidence to the contrary. In fact, there's not even evidence of him making the claim himself, and so on and so forth. There's all these examples. If you look in history, the way that Earth was supposed to be the center of the universe, and we're not even the center of. There's nothing that we're the center of. The idea that we're somehow chosen or special is ridiculous. When you look at the vast amounts of outer space, is black holes meant to crush and rid from existence anything and everything that it gets near. And and Darwin, when he said said something along the lines to his wife that the reason that he put off the publishing of Origin of the Species for so long was because he was killing God. And in many ways, yes, because until that point, all of the evidence of like why creatures had become what they had become was given to, oh, well, that must have been a divine being that had made that happen because of the absence of any science to the contrary. And so the way that goalposts are constantly being moved, and I see this with like progressivism inside Christianity is a great example, but it's certainly not alone in any of the religions. The way that, especially lately in the 20th and 21st centuries, the idea that, well, morality is now for humans to interpret. When the Bible, when it was put together, the number of people on earth who could actually read the thing was like less than 10%. It was certainly not of the poor people that the New Testament was written to address. And so therefore, it was never designed to be interpreted by the individual reading because nobody was actually supposed to read the thing. Nobody could. And so the way that the goalposts constantly move and never move in the other direction, it's always throughout history moved against the existence of God. I can't think of anything else that I could possibly believe that has made claims to existence and has been proven wrong over and over and over again, and I still would have faith in it. It just wouldn't make any sense for me to do so.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of good insight in what you shared there. So let me make a statement and see if you would agree with it. The sum of human knowledge is as a drop in the ocean of our ignorance.
Possibly. It's hard to say because the truth is that that drop is growing bigger and bigger by exponential leaps.
Sure.
All the time.
Human knowledge yes, I agree.
And so we can't, ignorance is sort of like trying to measure an absence. You can't really measure. We don't know how big the cup is.
Right. It can only be an inference.
But it might be true that we're actually near the limit of the cup, but we have no idea.
Yeah.
Whether we're near the limit or nowhere near the limit. So I guess I couldn't agree with that because of that very ignorance that you're speaking of.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. But if you looked at the sum of human knowledge as being the area within a circle that's constantly expanding, then the circumference is constantly expanding, which means that it is constantly exposed to more and more of what we don't know. And so it might be an illusion that what we know is insignificant in comparison to what's outside, but we're constantly being exposed through growing knowledge to more and more things we don't know. And again, I realize that's a metaphor. It's not a proof.
Yeah. And it's fortunately it's thanks to technology, thanks to science, thanks to the scientific method, and all of these very, very secular human-created things that circle is expanding faster and faster all the time.
Real quick, wouldn't we all agree that the goalpost, if we're going to call it goalpost moving, isn't that the same thing with science too, though? I mean, because science used to believe stuff that isn't true. So I don't see the Bible as necessarily unique in that. I see it like, why wouldn't we have a deeper understanding of how the Bible is to be read and interpreted as we go along? I mean,
the difference is actually really significant, and the difference is that science, this is one of those things that people always say, oh, well, that's just a theory. The theory of evolution is just a theory. And theory is a really weird word, but it's important in the context of science because science never wants to say this is absolutely definitively true, right? It's always just a theory that then other scientists who are all desperately out to make a career for themselves and get published and fame and fortune await them when they're able to prove something that has been held as being a truth in science is now untrue. Everyone's actively working to prove whatever theory that's measurable is actually not the truth. So yes, it's through science's own process that things that were purportedly considered solid theories, for example, are actually untrue. In contrary, let's look at one book and for one religion that makes a claim to truth, but there is nothing within that book or within the structures that surround that book that are out to prove that it is untrue. And that certainly hasn't happened until recently outside of that. So it's a very significant difference. Science doesn't make the claim for truth, especially not making the claim for truth within what it doesn't know or can't measure. But religion does that every day, all day. It says, in this ignorance, inside that what Jack's mentioning about the circle outside of our circle of knowledge, out there, that's what we claim to know. Whereas science would say, no. All we can claim to know is the stuff that's within the circle.
Yeah.
And even that, we're going to challenge it all the time.
Sure. But I think the challenge sometimes is I think people can take that argument to say that, and therefore the only reality that exists is the part that we can verify. And there's this question of, is there something beyond? And again, nobody can know. But I think sometimes, I guess what I have a issue with, and it kind of gets back to my statement that I asked for your response to on the, the relative proportions of our knowledge to our ignorance. That one of the traps sometimes that I'll say atheists or materialists can fall into is the obverse of what religionists have done in past years. There's a rumble in the skies. What is that? We can't account for. Must be the gods. They must be angry, right? Well, now we know the physical origins of thunder, and we say no, that's a natural phenomenon.
God was moving his furniture.
God was moving. But you're like your comment about black holes. I mean, sometimes I think that atheists can take this tack of, see, this is obviously random, and therefore the universe is obviously not made by a designer. And my argument would be, I think we know too little to be definitive about some of the things that we tend to use as building blocks for our
yeah, but I think that, all right, first of all, there's a difference between theism and Gnosticism. So theism would be what we believe, and Gnosticism is what we know. I think almost all atheists are agnostic atheists in that they don't know, but they don't believe. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's also quite a few who are religious, who are agnostic theists. They don't know that there is a God, but they believe that there is a God. Mm-hmm. So it's very challenging to try to blur those two things, because that's very, very clear. And that's why, like when you asked earlier, what's the 1% to 2% that causes you to not know? That is my agnosticism, right?
Yeah.
So when atheists say the stuff that I don't know, I don't know what is out there, I don't think anybody would say, I definitively know what I don't know. That's exactly what atheists don't do. They're saying it could be one of 100 gods. It could be, and probably not. And the reason that they don't is because of the moving goalposts that we were talking about earlier. As that circle of knowledge grows and grows and grows, and all the places in which God claimed to live is turned into, poetry, as you mentioned earlier, or turned into parable, or turned into, but we're just kidding, I guess. Like, that is when all those claims get eaten away and chiseled away. At a certain point, you got to go, well, geez, you've claimed all this other stuff inside this big circle, and that wasn't true. Why should I believe that the stuff that's still out there is also what you claim to be?
Mm-hmm. Well, I understand your point. I think you overstate when you say atheists say this. I mean, I think there are atheists saying all kinds of things, just as there are believers saying all kinds of things. So,
sure. I just think that it's at least from the we'll say that the most popular of the published authors, and certainly the most visible of those in the atheist community, I think would agree with the idea of there being some amount of agnosticism in their beliefs. Or, I'm sorry, agnosticism in what they purport to know.
Well, I would agree. So, it's interesting. I was reading something by Steven Weinberg not long ago, and he was kind of making the argument for why he, is an atheist. And his kind of thing was the Holocaust was kind of, that was the, whatever metaphor you want to put to that, the straw that broke the case, like I can't believe in a God who would allow that. Mm-hmm. And so I've, and I can't remember exactly how I ordered it, but basically, so I've developed this, intellectually viable alternative. Now, what's interesting to me about that is he's basically saying I made an emotional decision, and I have developed, a rationalization process for why I have grasped that. I think that's true. Like, if you read a lot of I'll say the current neuroscience books, that's kind of what they say human beings do. And I would argue that that's true of believers and non-believers alike, that we primarily believe things because we attach to them emotionally in some way, and that primarily we use reason to justify what we've already decided to believe or disbelieve.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true, but I think that what you said about Steven Weinberg, where that was the straw that broke the camel's back, mm-hmm. is probably exactly that. The problem of evil is a huge problem.
Yes. A
huge problem in the idea of there being a beneficent deity, mm-hmm. but not in that there is a deity. It's sort of irrelevant, especially if you read the Old Testament. That is not a beneficent God, at least not in terms of in human morality that I'm familiar with. So I think that when you speak to one person saying it was a straw that broke the camel's back, there's a lot of other stuff. There's a lot of other straws. And that would be
fair enough. Fair enough.
And then to add to that, I guess I'll stick to that. But yeah, I think that is the problem of evil is a big problem, and but it doesn't really speak to whether is the existence or non-existence of a God. I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. All right, Godless, why don't you? If I'm counting correctly, I think you've shared two of yours. If I'm not mistaken.
So the first one was that by the same logic, I believe everything else. I can't believe in a God. I don't know whether I really went into too much depth there, but there's just there's nothing that by the same logic pattern that I undertook to decide, for example, that the light's going to turn from red to green most of the time when I'm sitting there at the intersection, or the same logic that I use to come to believe that my parents are my parents and not somebody else's parents besides my brother. That sort of thing. There's a logic that was put into all of these things that I now purport to be true by that same logic process. There's nothing that I've come to believe to be true in the same logic process that would be necessary to decide that, yes, there is a God. And then the second one being just the moving goalposts of history. And the moment that you look through the history of belief, and there's the nun Karen Armstrong wrote a book called History of God, and I know she wrote that book as to be a sort of illustration of how important God was in the history of mankind from the time that first time people were able to draw something in the caves. But by my interpretation, all it purported was the importance that people have always put on needing to understand things that they couldn't understand. And therefore, just like what you were saying, Jack, then going, oh, well, then let me emotionally come up with a reason for what I don't understand. And that must be a huge unseen being in the sky. And I guess my third reason would be that there is, and this is not so much, this is not as strong as number one and number two by any stretch, but I think it's important And it's the lack of inquisitive thinking on the part of people who believe. And to explain that, I made a New Year's resolution a long time ago when I weighed a lot less than I do now, that if I walked into a restaurant and I looked and scanned at the people in the restaurant and most of the people in the restaurant were overweight, I knew I better leave because the food here is going to make me fat, you know? And that was a New Year's resolution, but it stuck with me because the same thing happens with when I find people who do believe. I find that there are very big limits to what they are willing to inquire about their beliefs. And when I scan the room, I go, well, I don't want to be in a room of people who don't have that sort of curiosity about all the things that they don't know. And my favorite example of this is the Bible itself. The Bible has been translated and written and rewritten, incalculable number of times over the years. And the books that are included, some are included, some are not. And there was a very deliberate, politically deliberate reason why certain books were included, certain books were not. If I were a believer in the Bible, I would want to be able to read as close to the original text as possible in their original language and understand that, to know that these translations and rewritings that I'm purporting to be, that I'm believing to be true and having immeasurable consequence if they are true or not true. I would want to know as close to its core exactly what it is that I want to believe. And I believe that, you know, if you are not able to read this important book in its original language, in the language it was actually written in, and preferably on the exact parchment that it was put on, you are getting, it's like looking at somebody through a series of mirrors. You're going to get a very, very different impression of what it is that was originally written down. This was not photocopied, and translations are always up to interpretation. That's why there's so many different translations of all of the books. So I don't want somebody's translation. I don't want somebody's rewriting of it. Oh, my apologies. I got sound here on my turn this off. Apologies. I don't want somebody else's interpretation. I want the truth.
Hey, the beginning of what you said, do you see a change though in Christians being willing to go with those questions and express those questions and kind of lean into mystery a little bit more? I mean, the tide's changing a little bit in that, I would say.
Yes, and I think that the huge number of people, especially young people, who are leaving religion and leaving belief is exactly that. It's the exact same side effect of what you're talking about. It's just that, and the same thing that I experienced myself. So, yeah, absolutely. I think that like progressive Christianity is one step towards that inevitable conclusion, because it, you know, as soon as you start to realize, well, now I'm trying to project onto what I'm reading, what I feel, or what I want to be true, whether it be sexism and racism and the Bible's what it writes about infanticide, for example, and all of these other issues. You go, well, no, I don't want that to be true. I want to believe something else. So I'm going to look somewhere else in the book for a passage that is going to reassure me. And those people who are willing to kind of go, well, wait a minute, I need to stop projecting what I want to be true on this book and actually read it for what it purports to be true. Well, then now you're getting closer to disbelief.
How do you feel about his point as far as?
Well, I would, my feeling, Godless, is I think you're overstating your point in a sense. And let me give you an example. so I took Latin in school. And what you do in second year Latin is you translate Caesar's commentaries. Because Caesar was kind of like a Roman Hemingway, short sentences, short words, very simple sentences. So easy to translate for a young student. So here's the deal. I've never heard anybody argue that Caesar didn't write his commentaries. I've never heard anybody argue that we don't know what Caesar was trying to say. And yet, if you looked at the documentation for ancient manuscripts, and I'm drawing a blank on the word for this particular area of research, but basically, kind of the divide in terms of old manuscripts is about 400 A.D., before the sack of Rome. So if you have something that dates before that, then there's more of a cultural continuity with it. And, the idea of the New Testament in particular is the old manuscripts, there are orders of magnitude more for the New Testament than there are for Caesar's commentaries. So, the idea that, boy, we don't really know what these original manuscripts had to say, I think that's a bit of an overstatement. You're right. There are people who will read particularly a dumbed-down translation and think this is what the Bible says. And, Joey's heard me complain about, the people who come in and say, well, this is God's view on this. And it's like, whoa, I am a lot less confident that I know what God's view is on something than you are. But aren't you, I guess what it comes down to is the curiosity. Uh-huh. Like, I mean, first of all, right? Like, I'm with you. But the curiosity in what the original text says is there's so little curiosity within, in particular, Christianity. It may not be as true in Islam, but I would just challenge that. I mean, maybe it's just my circle, but I know. Yeah, and the example is exactly what you're saying. Like, why do we know that Caesar's writings are true and come from Caesar, but not the Bible's? It would be because there's lots of historic evidence from outside of wherever it was that Caesar wrote. I'm not trying to make the argument. I'm not trying to make the argument about the accuracy of Caesar's commentaries as history versus the historical accuracy of the Bible. I'm just saying you were making a point earlier about transmission of manuscripts and transmission of, how can you be sure that what you are reading is what was actually written? And my point is, I think you can be at least as confident of that as you can when you read Caesar's commentaries that you know what Caesar was trying to say. Except for a couple reasons. First one being that Caesar always wrote in Latin, to my understanding. Mm-hmm. And there's plenty of people who read and have seen the actual original text that Caesar wrote down on. There's no original text, but go ahead. Okay. Well, even so, like there is the outside evidence that what is inside those texts aligns with other evidence. And then we can go, well, all right, this is probably Caesar's perspective, which is very important, but it's, for the most part, it's purporting true events to a certain degree, because again, Caesar was known to be a storyteller and be pretty grandiose about, whether there was 150,000 soldiers that he had when he defeated that army, or whether he had, as he claims, only 15,000, and then there's a lot of evidence that that number's a little big. The difference with let's start with just the New Testament is that don't have any of the original documents. Two, it wasn't Caesar who wrote, or it was Caesar who probably wrote this stuff. In what was written in the Bible, there's very little evidence that even the authors that are claimed to be the authors are not the authors. The third thing being that the texts in the Bible were copied and copied and copied over and over again, and even in important words in the Greek, like I think that the symbol for God in Greek, if I recall, is something like a circle with a line through it. But then there's another word that
is another noun that could mean something incredibly different, that is also a circle with a line through it, but the line is much higher. If you're picturing a monk by candlelight spending hours and hours hand copying the text from one piece of paper to another, or parchment to another, you could see how something, as an example, as simple as using the circle and putting the line a little bit too high, and now all of a sudden all future copies of that parchment now have the wrong interpretation, the wrong language altogether. And it's just one example. And
right, but see, my point is, I think you're making my point, is there are no original, like we don't have the Caesar's autograph, and so there are copies and copies and copies made, because that's how you transmitted books. Mm-hmm. And yet, I've never heard anybody argue that we don't know what Caesar intended to write. Now, I'm not making an argument about the accuracy of what he wrote, because as you said, he was a person he had his own agenda in writing this stuff down, right? But the transmission is what I'm going after. So, in contrast,
we don't know. Again, the two important factors are what you just said. Like with Caesar's agenda, we have a pretty good idea because of other writings by other people from who were around Caesar at the same time. Mm-hmm. We have a pretty good idea as to what it is that he was probably, in our imagination, and that does change and evolve over time. We have a fairly good idea as to what he probably purported. And even there, to be honest with you, like when I'm thinking of it, the truth is that there are texts about the Roman Empire that were written early in the 20th century that have a very, very different interpretation as to things like what it was that Caesar was trying to do, or what he's trying to say there, or all that stuff. There are differences from the early 20th century to what is often by historians considered to be true now.
And yet you can reason from a text that is reliable.
No, you have to rely on the other evidence.
Oh, I'm not saying that. No, I agree. No, but my point is, in terms of trying to say what is it that Caesar was saying, you're not arguing about what words was he using. You've got a text that you accept the transmission to be reliable. And then, you apply whatever test you want to apply to how you interpret it, whether you say, well, yeah, he says this, but this other guy says this, and, whatever. So...
See the thing, if when Caesar makes a claim, let's say, for example, that I had 15,000 soldiers who defeated this humongous army in this battle, right? Mm-hmm. When all the other evidence that we have was that probably his army was 10 times that, mm-hmm. because we know what his supply lines were like, because somebody else wrote about supply lines. We know, all these other reasons, right? Yeah. It's the same thing with the Bible, where one thing after another, like let's take for example, like the claim of the flood in the Old Testament. Like for centuries, that was believed to be unequivocally true. But now that we have, the geologic record, we have just the, people actually wondering, all right, this two animal thing, how does that exactly work? And how do you get animals from one side of the world to another? And now that we know about continental drift and, what's the original name for when all the land masses were connected all at the same time? And
Pangea?
And then eventually you've got the continents are disconnected, so now you can't get animals from one continent to another. And how did they get to the boat that way? All this stuff, you end up going, rewrite. This was a parable. And it's like, well, wait a second. That's not what it claimed to be, nor that it claims to be. It claims to be a truth, and it's only through the outside evidence that now we have to make a change on what the Bible does claim to be true.
Now, see, if you look at the first 12 chapters of Genesis, which would be kind of the prehistory chapters, you're saying that claims to be true. I don't see where it's claimed that that's the case. That these, and you've got to look at that and say these were clearly snippets from different documents that the editors who put together Genesis included. And then the question is, why did they include them? My argument would be they were trying to make theological points, not biological points.
Why? But why would you believe that? Why not believe that they were trying to make political points or trying to make
because
moralistic points?
Well, because I would say, what the Bible claims about itself and other, is that The purpose is to lead you to a knowledge of God. It is not to explain the physical origins of the universe, for example.
But that would be using it to prove itself. So
I understand.
So you can't do
Well,
that.
you can't prove, and I'm not trying to argue for a proof. I'm just trying to say, how do you interpret a document like this?
But you are like trying to find a reason for a belief.
No, well, that's an interesting one. I mean, what I was saying earlier was, I think you could make that argument about virtually every human being, that we choose what we think is true and then we try to justify it. And I'm not immune from that.
I would wholly disagree with you on that.
Well, you ought to read some more contemporary neuroscience then, because that's what it argues about the way human beings make major decisions.
I did not choose my non-belief in God. That was not a choice. And I promise you, I would, if I had power over that choice, I probably would have done something completely different. Because, especially over the last, 15, 20 years, like, it is not easy what you lose. I'm thinking of the story, Joey, that I sent you yesterday of this, the Christian musician who's now come out of the closet.
Lead singer of Hawk Nelson, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this guy, there's no way in the world he chose to not believe in God. There's no way, because his entire social structure, his family, his career, everything revolves around the need to believe in God. And he stopped. There is no way anybody in their right mind would make that decision.
Well, I mean, it kind of relates to what you said earlier about one of the things that's hard to challenge about believers is if they talk about, well, I've had this experience. There's no way for you to get inside of a person and prove or disprove that, and the same is true for me. I can't. And I'm not trying to make an argument on any of these things that, hey, I can say definitively that this is so or that is so. I think one of your comment earlier about agnostic atheists and agnostic believers, I would say that, and you're one of those and I'm another, in the sense that as long as you're not at 100% on either one, that by definition is kind of the category that you fall in. And yet all of us have to make choices about how we're going to orient our lives and what's the belief structure that's going to underlie how we live. And the fact that there's uncertainty in that doesn't relieve us from the necessity to make a choice.
But I don't know that choice has anything to do with belief or non-belief. It just has choices about what we do with our lives and how we act.
All right. Jack, why don't you move to point 3?
No! You throwing the towel in on him, Joey?
Not at all. Well, so actually my point 3 was the Jesus rose from the dead.
Gotcha.
And my point 2 was Jesus' life and teaching. And my point 4 was the one that you had kind of pointed out as the one that's always obviously difficult to try to address by any outside person, and because I've experienced God's Spirit in my life, and it's a mystical thing that I don't understand, but it's also this practical thing that has enabled me to live more as the person that I seek to be, and So anyway, I mean, we're talking through all these things. I mean, I actually like the way that the conversation has gone, Joey, and thanks for giving us the opportunity to just go back and forth, because I think this is more, one of the things I appreciate about you, Godless, is, I don't feel like this isn't about debating points. This is about trying to, pour through these things that people disagree on and have for a long, long time, and to which there is no definitive answer, I think, that at least we figured out a way to arrive at yet. And yet, we've got to decide what we believe when we're, Yeah,
I think almost everybody struggles with doubt. And, especially, unfortunately, I think that believers have to struggle with doubt quite a bit because of the absence, because of what we were talking about earlier, you have to project God into the areas of your life in which you don't know anything about, the areas of ignorance that not human ignorance, not just our own individual ignorance, although that's certainly a part of it. But you have to project God into those pieces of your life, because you cannot project God into what it is that you know. Like, you cannot, for example, pull out your mobile phone and press the power button. It turns on and you go, thank God, and actually mean God, because it's not. It's because of something else. And there's in no place in our lives that we definitively know, yes, that exact right there, that's God. It always has to be his presence, his, in quotes, in the place of an absence.
Yeah. I mean, I personally feel not being God kind of it almost sets out the rule that certainty is not something that I can have. I mean, I truly believe that. I mean, now, does my faith, do I feel personally convinced? Sure. But for me to say I'm right and you're wrong, I just can't go there. That's just not territory I can go into.
Yeah, but I guess that certainty, though, is what I was talking about earlier, about how, so how do you decide, how do you come to a conclusion whether anything in your life, whether you believe it to be true or not.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing else in our lives where we go, well, all right, so it's consistently been, shown to not be true on these other places they said it was true. And, really logically, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to explain anything else. But I still believe it to be true. Like, the only times that happens is when you're talking about something emotion. And that is exactly what we were talking about earlier, about how you're projecting emotion to convince you of something.
But see, and I totally agree with you, and I think that's because the supernatural and the spiritual realm is in a different category. Like, it is something separated. It's not something that science can say yes or no about. So I see that as the one exception of me. I believe, I believe, I feel God's presence, but yeah, I mean, it is in a different category for sure.
The other thing that I would say, though, Godless, is that while none of the answers that, like if we were to talk about how do you, go into a detailed discussion about how do you rationalize origins with the Genesis account, the scientific evidence versus that. I mean, I've got what I think is at least what is for me at least an intellectually satisfying answer. I'm not saying that it's definitive, but to me it's important to ask those questions. I don't think for most Christians it's a matter of I've just got to close my eyes and hope because there's no rational basis for this. I don't think that's any more true for Christians than it is for people. I don't think that's any more true for believers than for non-believers, is I guess what I would say.
But aren't you just defining faith?
Well, what is faith? My faith isn't in a particular narrative. The question is whether there's a God, and if so, what that God is like, and can that God be known?
Right, but I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but I would define faith as being believing despite any, believing despite the presence of evidence.
Well, see, what you're kind of saying is, despite the fact that the evidence points in the opposite direction, you choose to believe anyway. And I'm saying, I don't think that. Faith is defined in the book of Hebrews as being sure of that which we do not see.
Right. So let me read back. So I want to make sure it's clear. Like it's not that evidence points in another direction. It's just evidence doesn't exist to support the claim of truth. It doesn't point to any other direction because there's nowhere else to point until you're talking about a very particular something that science is trying to research in order to find out why that exists. It's funny because like in Six Sigma, which is a manufacturing process, you try to figure out like why is this machine producing the results that it's producing? And they got a concept called the 5 whys, and the problem with the existence of God is it doesn't hold up to the 5 whys. Once you dig to the second or third why, there's nothing. And so again, like by that argument, I wouldn't believe anything is true unless I had gone through, for example, the 5 whys process or the scientific method, or
I just think there are limits on the scientific method that cannot address the questions that faith raises.
So paranormal.
Well, I'm just saying it's beyond a materialistic explanation.
Poltergeists.
No. I think we haven't been diminishing each other here, and I don't think that's a fair comment.
I mean, but that's what the supernatural is. It's things that science cannot measure. Okay. And so if we look at what else is science incapable of measuring besides a supposed deity, right? Like the list isn't all that long, except a whole bunch of stuff that people would just make up.
But if the supernatural exists, science can't measure it, right?
That's true. Let's say that I think it's Daniel Dennett's example was, if I say that there is a giant teapot in the sky, there's nothing and science can't measure it. Well, who are you to say that there is no giant teapot in the sky?
Sure.
Like you can come up with anything your imagination come up with, and then stop add as an addendum to it, and science can't measure it. And whatever it is that you just said, well, yeah, it might be right, but how likely is that?
I mean, I get that, but I think that goes to Jack's point as far as I don't think either one of us see our faith as like this unsubstantiated thing that there's nothing that lends us to believe. Because I'm with Jack. I mean, I obviously believe that there's enough history and enough honest reading of stuff that points to a resurrection, for example. So, that right there, then I start being in tune with stuff that Jesus said, and then that leads me to have certain beliefs about God and everything. So, there's not a whole lot of writing about a giant teapot. So.
No, but as you're talking about like the resurrection story, it is a story. There is not contemporaneous evidence that is true, and that's
except for all the contemporaneous accounts. I mean, what?
Yeah, exactly. But there's just absence there. So we can either believe it happened out of faith.
Well, see, I would agree. I would argue that that's the most logical conclusion to draw from the gospel accounts.
But
something extraordinary, unthinkable happened there, and what they record is just their inability to grasp at the time. What in the world is this?
But that's very different from what we were talking about with Caesar's writings, because at least with Caesar, there's lots of contemporaneous accounts. With this, there's none.
There are multiple contemporaneous accounts. They happen to be collected in a single book.
No. I'm so sorry, but it's bunk. It's absolute bunk. There is no, there's nothing that. I mean, even the books in the Bible weren't written for 100 years after the events.
Well, see, that's not true. The book of John, the book of John, which was one of the ones that was always argued to be, just the theological arguments had to be centuries later. Actually, the earliest dated fragment that we have from an Old Testament manuscript is from the book of John, and it's within the 1st century. Right, but that's not like Caesar, the day of, and everybody around Caesar on the day of. Well, I'm just saying. No, I mean, I can't remember what happened last week. If you were to ask me to write a book about what happened 40, 50 years ago, I'm going to have a real hard time, and I might do like Caesar did and say, well, that guy, we thought he was dead. It's not such a good story. Let's, we made a mistake. You walked out, you can come up with all sorts of reasons, political, sociological, etc., as to why it was written the way it was written. But just like any other text of that time, it doesn't, because it claimed to be true, therefore is true. I agree with that, but I'm just saying I think the gospel accounts have held up very well under centuries of scrutiny. The idea that, I think you're dismissing them a lot more easily than if we had time to pursue this topic, then they could be legitimately dismissed. Now, I'm not saying that everybody accepts the evidence in the same way or the same evidence, Part of it is how you weigh this versus how you weigh that, and so on. But I think to argue that the Gospels aren't directly derived from eyewitness accounts, I think the evidence is that they are. And I could refer you to books, but they're not necessarily books you'd want to read. I'm not.
Well, I've read a lot, and unfortunately,
I'll let you have the final word right here.
Sorry?
You've got the final word right here. And by the way, I'm going to send you some digital tracks, and they're going to get you, man. They're going to they'll get you. Well, you'll be convinced.
Yeah, unfortunately, I feel like that time of my life where I spent so much time researching and comparing and thinking and considering, I've kind of moved on. Like, that's part of the reason that I'm at that 98, 99%. I only have one life to live, and for the rest of what I have left, I'm going to try to soak up every moment of it that I can, doing things that I will, enjoy and will, actually that are true. And so, referring books like Bart Ehrman, I can't tell you how many of Bart Ehrman's books I've read. And when I would compare them to other books that were purporting what you're purporting to be true, I would find, as just one example, that, this guy has been researching this a lot more stringently than these very, very surface level research is being done, often by people who it is in their interest, like the singer of this Hawk band. What would they call Hawk
Nelson.
Hawk Nelson. Yeah, it is in their interest to make sure that that their conclusion is already meets a certain conclusion. They are not going to use a scientific method and therefore come to a very different conclusion, because their career would turn out in a very different way. But when it comes down to it, like when I go through all of the reasons that you think that the existence of God is true, it all requires believing a claim without evidence. And I'm not making the contrary, exact opposite claim that without evidence you therefore must believe something else. I'm just making the argument that without evidence, you can't believe that to be true, because it's consistent with everything else that, the system of how you decide what's true and what's not. But, again, much respect. I appreciate the conversation this time around. This one turned out, I think, a lot better than our last conversation as well. So I'm appreciative of that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Awesome. Good having you both. And yeah, we'll have to do it. We'll have to do it again. We'll have to take one of these points and talk.
Yeah, that's what I keep on telling you. Joe, you don't believe me when I tell you.
Did you like that? You like how I just stayed out of their way, too, and pretty much kept my mouth shut? I tried to interject. Those guys were just gone. They were gone. Well, like I promised, here's a song from the Explorers Club. By the way, go to freemusic.theexplorersclub.com for free music from the Explorers Club and just a way to stay up to date with this wonderful band.
There we will see the sunshine rising over the sea. Night is long, the clouds like curtains keep the moon from lighting. May the song be the promise that you seek and find inviting. It's true that I do sometimes feel that you couldn't hear my love. Look to the horizon, there we will see the sunshine rising over the sea. When we're together, nothing is out of reach. This is our dream.